First of all, I must confess, I'm not a theoretician or philosopher, so I hope that doesn't leave me too bare for you. I'm going to start, though, with just very briefly how I got involved with Paul Robeson. In high school, in the 10th grade, I think it was, right earlier, our mathematics teacher said, "Class, before we turn to algebra, I want to present a very interesting piece of music." It was the Ballad for Americans. And at that time, in 1939, it was widespread, hugely popular. You know, it was played at the Republican convention as well as the Communist convention. I don't think she knew that second part, but she knew the first. That was my introduction of a long relationship, which continued during the war. I'm pretty positive that I was at Madison Square Garden for a rally for help for the Soviet Union. It must have been about 42, with Robeson singing. I was certainly present in the Madison Square Garden when Robeson spoke against the Taft-Hartley bill, against labor. And then I was a part of the Henry Wallace Progressive Party movement in 1948. And this was important in America and important for Robeson and important for me. This was an attempt to save the left-wing movement, which had developed in the 1930s, and which was a mass movement led not totally, but to a very large extent by communists, by the Communist Party. There were others involved, but the Communist Party played a leading role in building up a union movement, and a movement which also changed the United States in terms of pension payment, unemployment payment, and so forth. It was a mass movement, and it continued through the war within interruptions, which I won't go into, but in 45, 46, mass strikes in the United States, 46, 47, which frightened terribly the powers that be, and and also internationally, because it led to the break from the Soviet Union to the USA during the war. The Cold War began almost immediately, in fact, even before the end of the war. And this was an attempt in the Wallace movement, the third party or progressive party, to keep this movement going. And the interesting thing about it was really a double movement. Part of it was the communists, who still had some great strength from the 1930s, and the non-communists, who, however, were not anti-communists. The left, the non-anti-communist left. And this had been a unity during the 30s with an interruption during the 1930s, during the Hitler-Stalin Pact, but had resumed, and this was an attempt to save it. And it meant that not only Wallace, but others, including Robeson, toured the USA in this movement. And I was involved in North Carolina, my first and only experience with the South and its horrors, but also I was in Boston. And Wallace and Robeson came to Boston, and one occasion is worth mentioning. Robeson, as I don't know if you know it, how many of you are old enough to know it, but it wasn't only his singing. When he got on the stage, there was immediately a huge ovation just to see this guy. There was such a charisma. And then when he opened his mouth, just speaking, it was, again, a huge ovation. And then when he sang, of course. But he usually spoke. And in his speech, I remember one thing. First, I should say that in this Wallace movement, it consisted of really basically of communists and non-communists, but not anti-communists. But because of this, the communists, to which I belonged, were extremely, extremely careful not to alienate the others, not to say anything which got them angry. In other words, to avoid the phraseology, the cliches, and even some of the ideas, to just not to alienate, to keep it unified. And this meant there was a certain reserve on this. Robeson got up and he spoke, and I can only remember one sentence he said. He said, and then after all of us, I think, don't we all even hope someday for a socialist America? There was absolute silence. Absolute silence. Because we weren't just used to saying such things. Nobody said such things. And suddenly, a moment, and then terrific ovation from the whole hall. Not only the communists, the others too dreamed of this. It was a very dramatic moment. That was in 1948. It was a disaster, as some of you may know. We hoped to have a third party, but it didn't succeed. Instead of the 6 million we hoped for, it got barely over 1 million. And it was really, it tried once again, but it was really the death of it. And because the right wing was, and the powers that be were too strong for us. And this meant that they embarked fully then on, domestically, the McCarthy wave, and internationally, Dulles wave. So one country after the other was Iran, Guatemala, and all the rest. And because the Wallace movement, its destruction was basically this loss. However, there was one last gasp, one last attempt to save something, based on the stronghold of the left and of the communists, was New York City. And this was at Peekskill. At Peekskill, they tried to have a concert to save. It was basically a defense, self-defense. And as you may know, if you know the story, most of you do, the first concert was broken up terribly, brutally, and it was decided we're going to answer back 1 week later. We're going to have a concert, but this time with defense, proper defense. This is the one where I was present at, and I cannot forget, it was in sort of a basin, a big wide basin, all around the outside. The working men, they were, largely communists, though certainly not all, from the left-wing unions, the furriers, the seamen, and so forth. I think most of them had baseball bats in the grass next to them and defending the lines. And the concert was wonderful. Paul Robeson, also Pete Seeger, Hope Foy, some may even know of her name, defended by a small group right around some trees. It went off wonderfully, but when it ended, it turned out that the bus drivers had obviously been organized to disappear. So there were no bus drivers. By the way, there were 25,000 people there. Many came by car, but a large proportion came by bus. No bus drivers. We organized as best we could with one person in the bus who said, I can drive a bus. As soon as we left the circle, or the inner circle, which had been around us, which the police kept out of the concert, but they let us out this one lane, and instead of going to the main road as we had come, they directed all the cars and the buses to a side road through the woods where there are bunches of men with stones, which destroyed the glass of almost every bus on the whole route, including mine, by the way. What we did is the men were told to take off our jackets and hold them on the windows, the women on the inside seat, and the children in between. Every bus was wrecked, and we had to go through this line. At the end of this line, this woody thing, that's when the police stopped us and said, they checked the driving licenses. And since most of them were not legitimate for a bus, we had to get out of the buses and walk to the station. But this was something which, of course, lasted me my whole life, and I can never forget. And it was the final destruction of the left in the United States, except for remnants, I would say. Courageous remnants, but remnants. So this was part of that was the McCarthy era, which centralized. There was a central law called the McCarran Act, which said that every person, a member of a left-wing organization, not only the CP but all the front organization, had to register with the police as an agent of a foreign country. And if you didn't register, you could be sentenced to 5 years in prison for every day that you didn't register. In other words, in a week, 35 years. Nobody registered. Paul certainly didn't, and I didn't either. But I got drafted, and I didn't know, should I sign or not sign, and I did sign that I had never been a member out of fear. And this meant that I had saw nothing of Paul Robeson for quite a while. I was drafted in the Korean War, came to West Germany. They found out about my dirty past as a leftist and a communist, and so I deserted and came to the GDR, by the way, first of all to Potsdam, and have a few recollections of my first period here. And one of them was the strange German habit of everybody shaking hands all the time. When you went to work in my factory, every colleague I had to shake his hand in the morning. And even kids going to school, you have to shake every hand. So I had to get used to that strange custom and to the German grammar, which I never completely got used to till this day. But also, two things which I remember. One was at the station, one of these, they were still using these big steam locomotives, big black steam locomotive in big white letters. This was in spring '53. Save the Rosenbergs. And to me, this was meaningful. This was Germany, 7 years after Hitler. And everybody knew the Rosenbergs were Jewish. So this was a symbol for me, which was part of the other aspect was not every bookshop, not the private bookshops, which there were quite a few, but every public, basically party bookshop, there were two portraits on the wall to be sold. They were there for sale. I think few people bought them privately for their homes. It was more for offices and schools and so forth. Two portraits, and who were they? One was Howard Fast, the writer, only till 1956, then they took him out. But the other was Paul Robeson. So that Paul Robeson's face and name were known absolutely to everybody. And this was a symbol for me that in East Germany, in the GDR, there was a prevailing anti-fascist culture, which also meant anti-racist culture. The films, the books, everything was based on anti-Nazi and anti-fascism. And I would, before going into that a little bit deeper, because there were contradictions, I should mention that there wasn't so much about Robeson. Well, there was occasional things about Paul Robeson in those years. I arrived in end of 52. Before 56, there were occasional mentions fighting for his passport, for Robeson. That came in the news, too, how his fight to get a passport. And then 58, there was a huge ceremony for Paul's birthday. That was his 60th, in the Friedrichstadt Palast, which was the biggest hall in East Berlin, and some of the greatest celebrities. And in that same year, there were two films shown. I think they were both in 58. One was the film, The Song of the Rivers, which Paul had to make, as I believe, I think The Song of the Rivers, Nancy, Susan, I think he made that privately or at his brother's home, Song of the Rivers. And not knowing that the text of the song he sang was by Brecht and the music by Shostakovich, which he only found out later. The other film, which was shown very widely in the GDR, was a special film made also very privately, just trying to avoid traffic noises. It was a film dedicated to the people of the GDR. It was only Paul, with Earl Robinson accompanying him, one song after the other, brief remarks, and those two films, which were probably, I'm not sure, I think they were probably not shown widely in theaters, perhaps as a newsreel, but certainly in schools and so forth. They represent a huge respect for Robeson, which prevailed very widespread in the GDR. He was known and really loved by just about everybody. Well, that's why I come to the contradictions. Of course, I found in the GDR when I got there first of all, that it wasn't quite the utopia that some communists may have dreamed possible. It was just full of contradictions. And however, the contradictions were the following. Everybody, openly, everybody was anti-fascist and anti-Nazi. There were other cross-currents. Some currents were of people who were simply careerists. They spoke the right language to get by or to get jobs, etc., and kept their own ideas to themselves. There was one group of, I would say, the dogmatists, who were like this. And then, of course, there were people who were still, in those few years, you couldn't change a whole population from being pro-fascist. A large Prussian war hated the Nazis because of what had happened to their country in 44, 45 with the bombing. They were not so pro-Nazi, but there were streams of it. But they kept to themselves. They kept their damn mouths shut. And this, to me, was very important. The whole open culture was an anti-fascist culture. And this included, on the question which was raised here, internationalism. There wasn't a kindergarten which didn't have a simple little thing with showing five children in 5 different colors, skin color. And it was part of the whole culture, basically, both international, but also working class. I think both were involved. There was a controversy between people like Bert Brecht and Hans Eisler, who believed in the stressing international working class culture, and they turned to that. The other side, in their 50s still, was still working to have a East-West German, a progressive German culture, Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven, etc., and to keep united in this sense. And these two things were in opposition. And basically, well, the Brecht-Eisler people did not really win out. They were always looked at with a certain amount of degree of caution, which I also note as personal way. But the other way didn't work out either, because after 1952, Stalin made his offer to have Germany unified, but on the condition no pacts, no military pacts. And this was turned down in Washington and turned down in Bonn by Adenauer. And from that point on, the GDR said, then, if there's no unification, we have to build socialism. Up until then, socialism was rarely mentioned. But as of that, just a few months before I arrived in the GDR, the decision now were out openly and strongly for socialism. However, this led to many hardships because trade was cut, and it meant building up an entire new basic industry. And this hardships, which led to the uprising in June '53, which ironically, you know, there was especially in Berlin, but in many other cities, an uprising in opposition. And this was on June 13th, 1953. And tragically, the Rosenbergs, the whole spirit to save the Rosenbergs, which was a reflection of the United States, they were killed on 2 days before. Or was it 2 days later?
June 19th.
19th. on June 19th. Yes, 2 days. It meant that those 2 final days and the days that were not really observed in any way because people were too excited and upset and involved in this country, their own country, so that the killing of the Rosenbergs did not get the mourning or the attention that it did in other countries of the world. So Robeson won his passport finally, and went to Britain. And the GDR expected and hoped for a visit very soon from Paul, but didn't get it so quick. Whether there was a certain feeling, Pete Seeger once said he found in his world travels, he'd always made a circle around Germany until 1976, I think it was, or 77. Perhaps that was involved, but maybe not. In any case, we read in the papers how Paul spoke and sang at the World Youth Festival in Vienna, and then he went to a big festival in Romania, and then he went to Paris, and of course he went to Moscow, and he didn't come to the GDR. There was a certain mumbling about that, I think, a feeling, why is he neglecting us? But then in 1960, he did finally come, and twice. He came in June '60 to a press festival of the Neues Deutschland, the main newspaper, just for, I think, a couple of days. But he was given a magnificent welcome. One of them, which I attended, was outdoors, and of course, thousands came. And yet, the main visit was in October, when he was really run through the mill. He spoke and sang at the Academy, where he became an honorary member of the Academy of Arts, which later led to the archive. He visited a factory, mostly women's factory, and spoke to people there. He spoke to, let's see, I have some of the others' notes. I think those were the 2 of the main ones. Well, I turned to the one I attended. Well, I was there at the Academy one too, but the most interesting one in the sport hall, which had been built especially for the first World Youth Festival in Berlin. There he spoke for the youth. And it was interesting because, first of all, it was a huge crowd. Second of all, his speech was not right at the start. They had a short program in advance. He was in the front row, and the program involved some youth groups. I think 2 international groups, 1 Greek and another, and then 1 group of African students. And these were South Africans studying in the GDR, and they performed this boot dance, a circle dance, and danced around. And one of them pointed to Paul. He said, come on. And Paul jumped up onto the stage, which was very low, and danced with him. And this was a short moment, but it was somehow a very, very heartwarming moment, and to me, in a way, a symbolic moment, because the GDR was pretty isolated in those days, in those years. It was, in fact, I think it was considered the bad boy in the whole communist East Bloc. The GDR was, the wall hadn't been built yet in 1960, but still it was considered the bad boy, the rough boy. And therefore, it took a certain degree, well, not of courage with Paul, perhaps, I don't know, but to really come out and favor the GDR. And that was, of course, the main event, aside from this one I mentioned, was at Humboldt University, where he got an honorary doctor's degree. And he, first of all, he had to descend this stairway with a famous quotation in back of the stairway. Do you know the Feuerbach thesis?
Philosophers have hitherto only point is to change it.
Exactly. And this was and still is in gold letters on the main staircase in Humboldt. It's the only thing that remains, actually, from the old Humboldt. But it's still there. But his speech was in the courtyard. And it's a big courtyard with two statues of Humboldt. And you know that one was a philosopher, one was a traveler who also came out very strongly against slavery, especially in the Caribbean and in Cuba and in South America, but also in the United States, where there are dozens and dozens of places and rivers named after him. But he had a huge crowd, mostly students, and he sang there for them and to a certain degree with them. And this was also a very symbolic moment. And in his speech, he mentioned the fact that in West Berlin, at the same time, who was visiting and speaking? Billy Graham. You know who that was? Some of you, the younger ones, don't know. But Billy Graham was this fundamentalist Christian preacher. And of course, he represented the opposite. And Paul made a few humorous comments about Billy Graham being on the other side. And here, my time is running out. Here is the clue to the question for me. The GDR was the bad boy. And of course, when the wall went up, far worse. But Paul, and not only Paul, I think stayed true and realized that the GDR, which was at the cutting line between these two worlds, the dividing line, by the way, right near us in Potsdam, yeah, it was part of it, and the lake front. But it was a cutting line in a way, and this is what some of the people there told me, including one from Stasi. He said, for us, this dividing line is the same as the front in Madrid in 1936-37. It's the dividing line between them and us. And when he spoke of them, I have done my job at that time was doing research, and research which demonstrated to me, and which I was writing about, how the Bundesrepublik, the Federal Republic, was really almost from the very top, all the top levels were completely, not completely, never they could, people lived and died, but to a huge, huge extent infiltrated by Nazis. And that was part of my job to demonstrate that. We had a world map. Every country where a West German ambassador had been a member of the Nazi Party, we had a swastika. And the whole world map was covered with swastikas. It made a big fuss in the world, and they hated it in Bonn, of course. But of course, it was wrong to say that Federal Germany was fascist. It was not, and is not today. But the leadership in every level, journalist, academic, ambassadors, you had people in deputy ministers and ministers who had been stormtroopers and killers of the worst sort. In the GDR, you had the opposite. When the GDR started, in fact, before it started, in 1945, under Soviet determination, all the Nazis were thrown out of the schools, or virtually all of them. I guess some mathematics teacher, etc. Mostly from the universities, except for medicals. But otherwise, almost all the professors, if they didn't leave on their own, many of them left, of course, went west before the Red Army came, because they were, but these people had to be replaced. It was a difficult, very difficult job. All the judges, there were no judges left here, because all the Nazis had been judges. All the judges had been Nazis. But this meant that the GDR was built on anti-fascists up to the very top. The top leaders had either been in prison or most of them in exile, not a few of them fighting in Spain, some in the Danish underground. The top for agitation propaganda, basically responsible for this. Albert Norden had been in the United States in exile, and it was partly those who had been in American exile who were able to bring a bit about Robeson and that spirit to the GDR, because the GDR was, of course, was naturally anti-American policy, and it was usually careful not to be anti-American in that sense, but to be against the baddies in America, the capitalists and so forth, and with which, of course, I agreed completely. But this could be primitive sometimes, or oversimplified. And I saw my job as trying to overcome this oversimplicity and to point out that the United States it wasn't just oppression of blacks, Indians, or workers. It was conflict of fighting back. And that, first of all, that's more important for a journalist to write about. But second of all, much more realistic. And so, especially because in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, these movements developed. What this means is that the GDR was constantly, had a currents and countercurrents underground. Not underground, but under the surface. Underground too. It meant that the official line was definitely 100% anti-fascist and anti-imperialist. But of course, you couldn't convince everybody, except that the pro-fascists and the racists, by and large, kept their mouths shut. There were some sad exceptions, because the GDR needed work. It was always short of labor power, and imported groups from abroad. The first group was from Algeria, and the second, then came the Cubans, and then came those from Mozambique, and then finally the largest group, the Vietnamese. And they were, despite what has been written about the GDR in the past, they were ghettoized and so forth. Actually, they got very, very good treatment in the newly built best buildings, these newly built modern buildings, but separate, which, of course, the Vietnamese and the others, they like to be that. They were with people they could talk with. But made for problems, especially not with the Vietnamese, but with the others. There were problems because it was mostly young men. And first of all, a lot of them came from the slums, and they were not exactly model citizens. And then came the fact that as young men here for several years, they were interested in meeting young women. And of course, that was at discos and similar. And the young white German men didn't like that a bit. Because they were, to some women, they were quite attractive. In some cases, they even had Western money, which made them even more attractive. But generally, there was a certain rivalry, and this could cause troubles. And so there were some troubles. The GDR did its best to mollify that and to bring contacts, but this was always a problem because the GDR people were relatively isolated from many of the problems in the world, whereas West Germany always had lots of foreign workers, especially Spain, Portugal, Italy. The GDR had not. And people were not used to foreigners so much. And so there were problems which emerged since unification, as we see today. But here I would say, let's see, just that yes, a few things, one important thing, perhaps the most important. The GDR, I shouldn't stress these problems. What I should stress is that the GDR, perhaps more than any other East European country, even perhaps including the Soviets, supported freedom movements, especially in Africa. Not only, first of all, in Spain, the anti-Franco, whereas West Germany supported Franco, the GDR supported the anti-fascists, who still had hopes in the early years. Second of all, Algeria, whereas the West Germany trained their officers, we supported, and there was a big campaign for, does anybody remember Jaimira Bouhired, who was a freedom fighter against the French? And she was a heroine in, if I may use that word, in the GDR. She wasn't known, she didn't arrive there. And then also Manolis Glezos in Greece, but especially against apartheid in South Africa and in Namibia. But also for her, I went to college in Leipzig. The first foreign students in the GDR, so far as I know, were 9 Nigerian students who were given special scholarships after a big mine strike in Nigeria, which was still colony then. They were, as solidarity, these 9 came to Leipzig. First they had to learn German, and then they went into all different fields. It was eight young men, 1 young woman. I never heard about the young men who studied. Some studied agricultural machines, one studied history, one philosophy. But the young woman studied medicine, and someone told me years later that she had become perhaps the best obstetrician in Lagos, which was nice to hear. I don't know if she's still alive. She was the darling here because she was very cute looking, and she had a short afro, and she was on every magazine cover there was. But the GDR supported apartheid in every way, including even military. There was a place up in the north where evidently, very secretly, some of the South African, what was it?
MK.
Yes, trained. And one South African told me years later, he said, we kept it very secret from the neighboring villages, way back in the woods someplace. But he went back years later and was in the bar and chatting. Oh, we all knew about it. We all knew about it, the Germans did. We knew they were training there. That was no secret. But they also had a special school, also in the north, for Namibian orphan children during the fighting in Namibia. And they had made special attempts at the school to send them to regular German schools, but to have Namibian teachers and counselors to make sure that they did not lose their Namibian cultural entity, that they didn't lose their contact. This was not so easy, because the children pick up things very quickly. But evidently, I don't know about Namibia, but in Mozambique, there's still groups of people who worked in the GDR and who were cheated after unification. They were cheated out of their final payment. And they've been fighting for decades now, I think unsuccessfully, if I'm not mistaken. I think it may also be true of the Namibians. The GDR supported Namibia. It also supported some of the other African younger states, but especially South Africa, and offered its help in publishing Sechaba, which was the organ of the South African freedom movement. Sechaba, and the Namibian one also. Time to quick, yeah? It's probably time to call it quits. Yeah? In any case, every support was given, and this has still had its recollections. Yes, a final remark. How much of this was lasted? In terms of anti-Semitism, it's interesting to note that there was a poll taken very shortly after unification, and it was found, if I remember the figures correctly, that in East Germany, about 6%. 4? Well, and I recall that 6% still had anti-Semitic ideas. In the Bundesrepublik, in Federal Republic, 16%. But every year this has changed in both, in the other direction, till today. And therefore, I should say that the GDR, it had terrible problems. And of course, it always faced this terrific pressure from the West, which was always superior in terms of consumer goods. It could never catch up. West Germany was one of the most prosperous countries in the world after the USA. It could never compete. It started out at a disadvantage geographically. It had no natural resources. It paid almost all the reparations alone. All the experts went west, often taking the plans with them. It was under complete disadvantage. And then it had this constant, especially when TV came, every evening people saw how beautifully and wonderfully the people in the West lived. And this created a great deal of jealousy and envy, but also attached to the people who never did really resist the old ideas. And this resulted in almost paranoid fear, which was not completely paranoid, because there was really a danger, which finally won out. They finally beat the GDR. This caused, however, Stasi, which then, in a vicious circle, caused people to be more against. It went like this. Basically, however, as I still see it, the GDR was really a bastion of modern-day anti-fascism and anti-imperialism. It was a barrier. It was a barrier to the West German expansionism of the Siemens people and the Krupp people and the Ruhr people and the Daimler-Benz people who are so powerful in the world, and Rheinmetall. They were thrown out here completely, hook, leaf, and sinker. They dreamed of coming back, and they didn't only dream, they worked to come back, and they succeeded in coming back. And it hurts me every time I see their even on Otis elevator, I get a little tiny stick. And as a last remark, we in the GDR, like myself, who favored the GDR and socialism, but were very skeptical about the leadership, because the leaders were old anti-fascists, almost all of them, but already many of them really senile or close to senility. And even if they weren't senile, they were so, from their young years, so now bitter, anti-fascist, but bitter, and also from Stalinist influences in terms of that they never found the proper way to speak to the people in a way which got through to them. It meant they just couldn't. There were exceptions. There were some very wonderful, like with the Robeson things, where they broke through to a certain degree with certain elements, and many young people. But there was always this lack of general rapport, and towards the end, when the economy was having bigger problems than before, and West Germany was really when finally in 1990, Kohl came across waving the Westmark, which was here a symbol of gold. It meant you can buy Opels with it, you can buy Renaults, maybe even a Mercedes. You can travel to Kathmandu or San Francisco. This one, perhaps a majority had still thought we should save the GDR, we should change it and get rid of the old, but at least save it. But this was till about November, December 1989. By March, April, May 1990, that Westmark and the bananas, which we couldn't get in the GDR, which you could now get, and kiwis, we hadn't even heard of them, or things like that. This made the day. And I saw the final remark, you keep pushing it off. We who favored it, but were worried because these guys were not doing their job properly. But we made fun, therefore, and after 61 of their term, you are not supposed to say, officially, to say the wall, the Mauer. That was taboo officially. You are supposed to say the anti-fascistische Schutzmauer, right? The anti-fascist protective barrier. That was the official term, and in schools, and it was always used. And we laughed at this because it was obviously basically meant to keep people in, not to keep people out. But brutally in many cases, but this was a general joke that this you said anti-fascist Brahma, but you always said with a grin, a sarcastic grin. But looking back at it today, for God's sakes, right here in Brandenburg, they're taking over. The fascists are. By God, we did keep them out as long as we could. And as soon as that damned wall went down, well, even before then, they started snaking in. But especially after the war, they marched through the street past my house, shouting Horst Wessel, hurrah, and with nationalist flags. By God, they've a terrific danger for Germany, and Germany is the most important country in Europe, barring Russia. Perhaps there was some truth to that old funny saying. And with that, I'll close. Okay? Also, no, excuse me. I forgot one thing. I had some slides for that. I forgot to mention, I'm sorry. We built an archive, very briefly. We built an archive at the Academy of Arts and an exhibition. And for the exhibition, we put out this catalog for the exhibition. Here it is, somebody can look in it. And the back of it, now if you turn on the back of it is a collage from Johnny Hartfield, who was the greatest collage artist in the world, the beginner of it. And very, very great person from the Weimar years. And he designed this catalog. And that's his picture. And also, symbolic was the meeting between Paul, you can switch? Between Paul and Anna Sagers, who was our best writer, a famous anti-fascist writer who wrote Seven Crosses, which was filmed in the United States, one of the greatest anti-fascist films. And this is when they met, before that dance with the Africans, they met there. That's it.
Thank you so much, Victor. A few questions for Victor before we take a short break. Nell,
you help me if I don't hear so well.
Sure.
Thank you, Victor. That was absolutely marvelous. Thank you. Marvelous. Thank you. Am I on?
Marvelous. Yeah.
He'll help me because I hear so badly.
Marvelous. Thank you. Fascinating. Two things I want to say very quickly. I remember the Wallace election in 1948. My parents and their friends were just destroyed by the loss. They were so disappointed. But I was writing an autobiographical essay myself, and I wanted to mention 1948 and the Wallace campaign. And I learned that two people whose names are now well known were Wallace supporters. One was the woman who became the wife of Martin Luther King. The wife, Coretta Scott King.
From whom?
Coretta Scott King, the wife of Martin
So,
yeah.
This is before she was married to him. And Pauli Murray, who is a well-known writer, became an Episcopal priest, and has, since her death, long time since her death, emerged as a kind of feminist and important American intellectual. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to ask you, you kind of drew a line between the xenophobia against foreign workers in the 60s and 70s in the DDR and the AfD right now. Are there any people who were still alive and active in both, Or is it a question of the xenophobia that is present in so many nations and is present in the former DDR?
The people who are then xenophobic are there, are still around. Well, yes, it depends on their age. Naturally, some they would be old. They would be old now, but I'm sure some of them are the same type of people, and they're not only still around, but in better position.
Still around.
He was a Wessie German.
I know he was a Wessie.
Inside baseball for us.
Okay, so other questions for Victor? Susan.
I mean, if nobody
Please,
else has
yeah.
any, because we do need a break. Just a note, I mean, I agree with absolutely everything you just told. I believe absolutely everything. And I don't know whether it was thanks to your efforts or other people, but when I came to West Berlin in 1982, Wessie is a slight term of abuse for a West German, and Aussie is, I mean, it's, yeah. Wessies, there was incredible amount of anti-Americanism in West Berlin. It was painful. And of course, Reagan was president, and, you know, there I come thinking, you know, hey, for, you know, a Jewish kid to set foot in, not a lot of people did in Germany at all in 1982. It was, you know, I thought I was doing them a favor. And you know, they would immediately hit me with things like, well, Reagan and McDonald's were basically all they identified me with. And my beginning affection for the DDR began because I could, with an American passport, go very easily. And instead of that, they said, oh, do you know Angela Davis? I've seen pictures of videos of Harry Belafonte singing in the Place der République, saying, I bring you greetings from the other America. So East Germany did, I gather, partly thanks to you and other people's efforts, they had the idea that there was another America, much more than they did in West Germany.
Let me add just something there, which I meant, but it got lost in the... first of all, that it lasted, as you say, with Angela Davis, was a giant campaign such as nowhere else in the whole eastern area. Every child knew about Angela. The postcards and letters, they came in by truckload to California. The judge didn't know what to make of it, really, because all schools sent it. There was it was a partly a remainder of this same, not a remainder, but a continuation of this same feeling of those days, and that's what I wanted to add. If you go to a vacation spot, the Canaries or wherever, and you meet Germans, you can tell immediately whether they're East Germans or West Germans if they're over 45, 50 years old. You ask them, do you know Paul Robeson? Almost no West German has ever heard of him. And every East German who went to school here, because he was taught in school in music class to everyone, so that you can it's like the only exceptions are left-wing West Germans, but there weren't so many of them. But it's a dividing line. And it continued also with the fight for the Wilmington 10 and in other fights. But so that there was which remains with some people, not with all of them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.